All right, so you ready to dive into this whole Ludwig Wittgenstein thing?
Let's do it.
You've provided some really interesting stuff about him. Clearly a curious mind to be sending all this our way.
Yeah, he's definitely one of those figures in 20th century philosophy who's, well, known for being both brilliant and really hard to pin down.
Especially when it comes to like language, logic, that whole meaning of life thing.
Exactly. What makes Wittgenstein really interesting is that, his own thinking about language went through some major changes.
Like he had a whole philosophical makeover.
Kind of, yeah. He had these two distinct phases in his work, each with its own set of, well, groundbreaking ideas.
It's like he took his own philosophical road trip. And those two books, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and Philosophical Investigations, it's like he sent us postcards from along the way, to sort of mark how his thinking was shifting.
That's a great way to put it. And understanding how his thinking developed is super important if you really want to grasp the full impact of his work.
Okay, so before we get to like the nuts and bolts of these language games and all that, let's back up a sec. Who was Wittgenstein, like the man behind the philosophy?
Right.
He was born in Vienna back in 1889, which, let's be honest, Vienna back then was quite the happening place.
Oh, absolutely. And he didn't come from just any family. He was born into a wealthy, influential Viennese family.
I bet those dinner table conversations were interesting.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure they were dissecting the meaning of life over their Viennese pastries. Because here's the thing. Wittgenstein didn't start out debating philosophy. He actually began his intellectual journey in the world of engineering.
Engineering. Really? So how does someone go from building bridges to pondering, like, the very structure of our thoughts?
Well, it seems that Bertrand Russell's work on logic was a major turning point for him. That's what sparked the shift from, the practical world of engineering to the more abstract realm of philosophy.
Okay, hold on. Because we've gone from engineering to logic to the big existential questions in about, 2 minutes. How does that even happen? What's the connecting thread here?
Well, that's the beauty of this deep dive, isn't it? Uncovering those hidden connections, seeing how seemingly different fields can actually intertwine in surprising ways.
So last time, we left off with Wittgenstein kind of going through a philosophical, crisis. Maybe like a big rethink. What was the deal with that, and where did it lead him?
Well, imagine spending years constructing this intricate philosophical system, really complex, only to step back and realize, wait a minute, this might not actually capture how language really works in our daily lives.
Okay, I get that.
That's basically what happened with Wittgenstein. He started questioning whether his picture theory, the one we talked about, was maybe a bit too rigid.
It's like realizing your instruction manual for language was missing a few crucial pages.
Exactly. He started to see that language is way more fluid, way more dynamic, and definitely more tangled up with our social lives than he'd initially thought.
So it's less like a perfectly reflecting mirror and more like a tool we use to navigate the beautiful mess of being human.
Exactly. And that shift in thinking, that's where his later work, Philosophical Investigations, comes in. It's in that book that he really digs into these new ideas. And this is where he introduces this concept of language games.
Language games. Okay, I'll be honest. The first time I heard that, I pictured like Scrabble or Boggle or something. Not exactly what I expected from a deep philosophical concept.
I know, right? The name can be a bit misleading, but it's a really profound idea once you unpack it a bit.
All right, so unpack it for me. What did Wittgenstein mean by language games?
Well, think about it this way. We don't just use words like they're these isolated things, each with one fixed meaning, right? It's like the meaning of a word, it comes alive in how we use it in different contexts, kind of like the rules of a game, right?
So how a word functions depends on what game we're playing at that moment.
Yes. Think about a word like, run.
Okay, run.
If you run a marathon, that means something different than running a business meeting or even a run in your stockings. The context, the situation, it shapes how that word is actually functioning.
That makes sense. Or even like how we were saying earlier, the word pain.
Yeah, good example.
Saying I'm in pain after like stubbing your toe. It's a totally different language game than when you say I feel your pain to a friend who's going through something rough.
Exactly. Same word, totally different moves on the board of language, so to speak.
It's like he's saying that language isn't this fixed thing. It's dynamic. It's changing all the time depending on who's talking, what they mean, the whole context.
It is. And that realization that meaning is fluid and contextual, it completely changes the game, so to speak. It's like realizing the board on which you thought you were playing chess is actually this constantly shifting landscape.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. But this shift to language games, it does make me wonder, what did that mean for his earlier ideas? Like that whole thing about the limits of language, the stuff we must be silent about? Did that go out the window too?
It's a great question, and the answer is, well, not so simple. Because on the one hand, if you see language as this ever-evolving collection of language games, it does challenge that whole idea of rigid limits, right?
It's like if the rules of the game are always changing, maybe there are fewer things that are truly off limits.
Right. But on the other hand, Wittgenstein was still deeply concerned with how philosophical problems could arise from misusing language.
Okay, so even if he's rethinking the limits of language, he still thinks we can get tripped up by our own words.
Exactly. And understanding how language games work for him was crucial to avoiding those pitfalls.
So last we left off, it seemed like Wittgenstein was rethinking some of his earlier ideas about language, like that whole thing about the limits of language, the things we must be silent about.
Exactly. That's a really key part of his later philosophy, and it's where this concept of private language comes into play.
Okay, right, private language. Remind me again, how did Wittgenstein view that whole idea?
So basically, he ends up completely rejecting this notion that we could ever have a language that only one person could understand.
Okay, I can see how that fits with the whole language games thing. But it also feels a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, don't we all have that inner monologue, those thoughts and feelings that are kind of just for us?
Absolutely. We all have that inner world.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Wittgenstein argued that even our most private experiences, they're still shaped by the language we've inherited, the language we use to communicate with other people.
So you're saying even when we think we're having a private conversation with ourselves, we're still drawing on a shared vocabulary. That's wild.
Exactly. It's like the words you use to think, the words you use even to dream, they come from outside your own head. They're borrowed, in a sense, from the language you've learned by interacting with others.
So even in our most private moments, we're never truly alone with our thoughts because those thoughts are built with these borrowed tools. It's like discovering that the furniture in the secret room in your mind was actually purchased at IKEA. It's not as unique as you thought.
That's such a great analogy. And you know, this whole idea has some really big implications for how we understand things like consciousness, our sense of self, even the relationship between language and thought. I mean, if our inner world is at least partially shaped by this public system of meanings, well, that makes you wonder, what does it even mean to have a unique individual perspective?
It's like suddenly those solitary poets and deep thinkers aren't looking so solitary anymore. But I don't know, there's something kind of comforting about that, right? Like even in our most private moments, we're still connected to something larger than ourselves.
Definitely. And you know, that actually brings us to another important aspect of Wittgenstein's later philosophy, the idea of philosophy as therapy.
Okay, therapy. Now that's not a word I usually associate with philosophy. It makes me think more of like comfy chairs and tissues, not necessarily dense books and abstract ideas. So how did Wittgenstein see philosophy as therapeutic?
Well, think about what therapy is all about, right? Often people go to therapy because they feel stuck, confused, like they're tangled up in knots of their own thoughts and emotions. And Wittgenstein, he thought that a lot of philosophical problems, they come from similar kinds of misunderstandings. They come from, as he put it, being bewitched by language.
Bewitched by language. What did he mean by that?
It's like we get so caught up in the words themselves and the way we're used to using them that we lose sight of what those words are actually pointing to. We start chasing after these phantom problems, problems that might not even exist if we could just step back and see the language games we're playing.
So it's not that the problems themselves aren't real. It's more like we need to find a way to untangle the language knots we've tied ourselves up in so we can see clearly again.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein, he saw philosophy as this tool for doing just that. He wasn't so much interested in offering solutions as he was in helping people clarify their thinking, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately find a way to liberate themselves from the traps of their own language.
That's pretty cool. So in a way, he's like a language therapist, helping us work through our philosophical hangups by showing us how language itself might be playing tricks on us.
Exactly. And like any good therapist, he doesn't give us easy answers. Instead, he gives us something much more valuable. He gives us the tools and the insights we need to do the work ourselves.
Which is probably why he's still considered one of the most important and influential thinkers of the 20th century. It's not just about the answers he provides, it's about the questions he makes us ask, the new ways of seeing that he opens up.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is, even though he was grappling with some of the most abstract, complex philosophical ideas out there, his work still feels incredibly relevant today. Whether you're into linguistics, psychology, art, literature, whatever, his insights about language and meaning, they just have this way of making you think differently about the world.
He's definitely given us a lot to chew on, that's for sure. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning about some guy who lived 100 years ago. It's about engaging with these timeless questions about language, meaning, and what it even means to be human. So if you're listening to this, whatever you're doing, whatever's going on in your world right now, take a moment to really listen to the language around you. Pay attention to the words you use, the words other people use. You might be surprised by what you discover. And who knows, you might even start seeing the world and yourself in a whole new light.
Well said. It's amazing how something as fundamental as language can hold so much power, so much mystery, and ultimately, I think, so much beauty.